Hour and a half. So yes, we are here to talk about a topic that I really wish that I had thought of our lawyer friend earlier before Peter reminded me that we have a lawyer friend, because there's a lot of legal stuff in here, and I got a good resource for that aspect of things. And I want to also acknowledge some research that Anne has done to put together a lot of information about this that certainly covers some of those bases too. But like, it would be great to have someone who really knows the law to talk about this. So what we're talking about today is the question of parents' rights, and why, when you hear parents' rights out in the media and in the social media sphere and all these places and out of the lips of right-wing ideologues, why it is more than just a nice, happy kind of a topic about, parents having rights with their kids. Like, that sounds reasonable, right? And that's one of these things, one of the strategies that is well known on the right, of taking something really, really awful and making it sound as reasonable as possible. I will say from the outset that my notes are chaotic. So I might be jumping around a bit. Yes, thank you, Columba. The good news is it's not as long as it looks, because I have like notes about the videos we're going to watch, which are like not for me to like recite to you, but they were just, oh, this is an interesting point. So that fluffed it up a bit, but it is not really 8 pages of material I'm hoping to cover. And the reason why it might go a little bit longer than an hour, we do have 2 videos to watch and everything that I have to say here, and I want to give you all opportunities to chime in when necessary. So that might eat up some time. The videos are both under 20 minutes long. I tried to think of ways to be like, can I cut this a little bit out or whatever? Unfortunately, one of them has like really terrible baked in Warby Parker ads. That's like, we could just, maybe you can try to jump over them when we get, because it's like, we want to sell out, but sure, information is good. So yes, and yeah, that one of the things we have to kind of just deal with is one of terminology. I have waffled a lot on what to call what we're talking about. Parental rights, you'll see. Parents' rights, you'll see. They're used pretty interchangeably. I think people don't stop to think that those might be 2 different things. I've kind of tried to come up with like what I think of as a way of nailing them down, but that's of limited utility because you're still going to see them used interchangeably out in the wild. So like, while I have come to be thinking about it just for my own purposes, I think of, and you'll see that it's not even reflected properly in the handout, because I made this handout several weeks ago before I thought this all through. I have come to try to think of parental rights as the sort of constellation of legitimate, legally sanctioned rights that parents have over their kids, because that's the term that I hear most often used when like a court is deciding visitation. That's a matter of parental rights. That's how they usually say that. And I had put under the parents' rights label all this other stuff that we're talking about. You will see that it both ways. You will hear it both ways, probably in the videos I'm going to share. They go back and forth. I don't even know. So just be aware of that. And what we're really talking about today with what the right refers to as parents' rights are things that we can maybe think of as parental authoritarianism, which Charlie informed me is a thing that already exists, but I think this falls under it pretty nicely. This all gets to the idea that the right is on a quest to confer legitimacy over their extremist goals. And in doing so, they're trying to conflate these things, these accurate, real things that we can think of as parental rights, basic and necessary, adjudicated and limited, all this stuff dealing with a child's custodial status, upbringing, safety, and certain unenumerated constitutional rights that one of the videos we're going to talk about will get into. And what they hope for, which are rights over their kids and frankly all other kids' beliefs, consciences, and bodily and moral autonomy. So when I speak of parental authoritarianism, I'm talking about this idea of the right's desire to have power over all children's beliefs, consciences, and bodily and moral autonomy, their right to do as they wish with themselves. So I want to start with something very current and very local. How many of you are aware that in the upcoming election, there will be a thing on your ballot called Proposition 1? Okay, good. You're aware of it. Can anyone talk to me about what Proposition 1 says and or does?
Is this a test?
It is a test.
Can I take a stab at it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So my understanding in Prop 1 is it extends the constitutional protections to things based on, I think it adds protected classes. So one of them, I think, is pregnancy status, age, ethnicity, national origin. There's like 2 or 3 more.
Gender identity,
Gender
gender
identity.
expression.
Sexual orientation.
Yeah.
Immigration status.
Yeah.
And I believe also
Birth.
pregnancy outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. So yes, so right now, the New York State Constitution protects people from.
For fertility.
Yes, yes. The New York State Constitution protects individuals on the basis of race, religion, creed, and one other thing, I think, maybe, and if you think of it, help me out. But it was just these 3 or 4 things.
And it's to protect people from discrimination based on those characteristics.
Correct.
How about orientation?
So that's one of the things that they're trying to add through Proposition 1.
Okay.
So right now, there's only these 3 or 4 things that I can't think of all of them: race, creed, religion, and maybe something else. Those are all that's covered right now, meaning all the other things that Charlie mentioned are not. So everybody, knowing what we now know about what Prop 1 does, do you want to vote for it? Raise your hand if you want to vote for Prop 1.
I still don't know what it is.
Discrimination protection for us, basically.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So we would want that.
We would want that.
I'm saying with him, I don't know much about it.
That's fine.
I
And that's
never
fine.
voted
That's one of the
either, so-
reasons we're talking about it, because a lot of people don't know about it and they read like the actual text and they're like, well, I still don't really get what it's saying.
I
So-
noticed that the vote no were always in yards that had Trump signs.
Right.
Yes, that should be a
That was
signal.
red flag right
Yes.
there.
That was a clue.
So I looked it up
Yes.
and it was clear.
So it's very important that we all be aware of what Proposition 1 is and what it isn't, who's for it, who's against it, what it does, what it doesn't do. There's a great deal of scaremongering, fear-mongering, and lying going on about it right now on the basis of those things that it is protecting from discrimination, but what the right wants to make out to be additions of all these rights that we don't have already, and it's unfair and unjust, and like we have to protect the children from all these things, because now with Prop 1, your child will go to school a boy and come home a girl,
Yeah,
and
right.
there will be boys on your teenage girls sports team, and they'll just be so much better than her, and isn't that terrible? And they'll be in the locker room, and that's awful too, and all these other things. And it also other things like giving, and this is beyond the scope of today, but because I'm going to focus mostly on the LGBTQ implications, but they say that it gives immigrants the right to vote, people who do not have citizens the right to vote. It doesn't do any of those things. These are scare tactics designed to get people who don't like those things to vote against Prop 1, when even a lot of the people who are currently so rabidly against it might like to have protections based on age, because maybe they're getting a little bit older. We forgot about disability, protections on the basis of disability. Maybe they are disabled or have loved ones who are disabled. Frankly, a lot of these people, hard for us to imagine, but it's true, have LGBTQ kids and grandkids that they do love putatively and want to not be fired from their job for being gay and would want them to be protected. But they're agitating against it. So this is all just to say, Prop 1 and the opposition to Prop 1 is one very current and very local expression of this desire to encode parents' rights. Can anyone think of any other ways that this parents' rights movement has found expression in all around the country in recent? Yes.
So I don't know if this is maybe where you're going,
Sure.
but the school choice and anti-schooling, homeschooling
Mhm.
movement that we're seeing.
Yes, I think that's very true. That is one I don't know as nearly as much about, but it's definitely in the mix. What else? I'll give you a hint. Think about where I work.
Book banning.
Book banning. What kind of books are people challenging around the country?
Gay shit.
Were you gonna say gay shit?
LGBTQ books.
Yes,
Fine.
exactly.
They're banning books like that.
They're challenge.
Oh, challenging.
Challenges. So the challenge is the first step and
Yeah.
yeah. So that's true too. What else? What else has been big? Not as much maybe in this current cycle, but like in the 20 to 22 election cycle, what was another big one that people were mad about? Not super relevant to, well, not unrelevant to us, but not directly related to us. So think of some letters, got some letters that might float through your mind. Do you remember?
alphabet community.
Yeah, different letters. We're talking about CRT and the
Oh, yeah,
critical
yeah.
critical race theory
Okay.
and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
You should have said, think of an old TV. That would have been so much easier.
Okay, I don't get the connection, but okay.
What is that?
It's critical race theory and the whole movement for diversity, equity, and inclusion. These are all things that proponents of parents' rights have gotten up and gone into the community and gone to school board meetings and gone on TV and all this stuff to rail against and say, we can't have that. They literally go to, recorded school board meetings. You can watch them and see them rage against these things.
Well, exactly. The DEI thing has impacted businesses.
Yes, tell us more about that.
There are businesses who had adopted DEI concepts, and the movement has basically said, we're not gonna buy your stuff, so they backed down.
Yeah, so John Deere, Tractor Supply.
Toyota now.
Yeah, I just
Toyota.
sent Peter an article yesterday about Toyota.
And so that's definitely in the same wheelhouse for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
A little fewer implications for the parental thing, but definitely the same overarching.
Yeah.
We hate everything and everyone's mentality of the right. So there's a video that I found. I'm not going to share it with us, but I want you to hear the title of it. Did you figure out where he was going?
Yes.
Okay, good. The title of the video was "My daughter's school transitioned her without telling me."
Oh, really?
So this is getting into this idea that schools are allowing, or in this case, doing gender transitions. And I wrote in my notes, right, the school transitioned her. Note the transformation of the word transition into a transitive verb. If we know I won't get into the grammar. It makes it so that the child had nothing to do with it. It was something that was done to the child rather than something that perhaps the child found easier to do at school than at home for some reason that we can't possibly imagine. And to me, this encapsulates the rights view of kids as subhumans who do not and should not have agency over their own lives. So when I talk about the parental rights, the parents' rights movement being parental authoritarianism, that's what I mean. They see their own children and everyone else's kids as not fully human. Therefore, we get to do what we want to them. I meant to say this at the outset. Some of this might be triggering because there is a lot of parental abuse just inherent in this kind of a thing, psychological, physical. So I should have thrown that out there earlier. I hinted at this already, but we have to also keep in mind that this movement is not just about their own kids, it's about everyone else's kids. Your kid can't watch the movie. Your kid can't learn the history. Your kid can't read the book. Your kid cannot exist as gay or trans with dignity. And if they don't get their way in exactly the way they want it, they'll withdraw their support and support policies that would bleed the public school system of resources while rewarding them to private religious schools or homeschooling, as Charlie very aptly pointed out. So whichever of these strategies succeeds, whether imposing their will on everyone else or taking their ball and going home and leaving everyone else to rot, everyone suffers for this group of people's personal, religious, and political beliefs. Conservatives, therefore, in this movement are trying to use the state to impose their will on others, which to me is a far cry from the usual policies they preach about everyone having to follow their own personal conscience and the state should stay out of it. When I say the state, I mean the state of the United States of America, the government, and all of these subsidiary states. We're gonna watch a video that says this, but it's not quite yet. But I took this quote from the second video we're gonna watch because I think it encapsulates it very well. It's a lawyer named Legia Miller. In kind of culminating her video, she describes all the types of things that the right is trying to do through these parental rights. Parents are, see, I keep doing it. Parents' rights. And she says, all of which involve the state stepping in and controlling children and their parents. It's clear that all of this parental rights bullshit is just conservatives talking out of their asses. She's colorful, it's great. Because if they really cared about a parent's unalienable right to have control over their child, how their child is raised, and what their child is taught, they would leave all of this, social media usage, medical treatments, and more, in the hands of parents. Instead, it's clear by their actions that they are concerned about controlling parents and children so they can be indoctrinated with the right ideas often based on a white supremacist Christian ideology that runs counter to the ethos of the US Constitution. Whew, right? That doesn't sound good.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm sorry
I
if
will
this,
not have the answer to it.
I'm sorry if this entirely derails everything. What do we know about the libertarian viewpoint on this?
No, you would think that they would not be down.
It's pretty mixed.
Yeah.
More conservative anti-authoritarian libertarians say that all of it's bunk and we shouldn't even talk about it. The more authoritarian libertarian, which is of course an oxymoron, will say like, of course we need the state to intervene, which is
Hypocrisy.
Here's a bottom line that I've come to about all of this stuff, about the parents' rights movement and what they're so focused on. How about instead of being so concerned about parents' rights, some of these activists refocus to consider more sharply parents' responsibilities, parents' obligations. What would be a good little slogan for that? It's your job to keep them from touching the boiling pot, wandering off the cliff, drinking the poison, not from exploring their identity and defining who they are. Do you want to say anything else about that, Elizabeth?
No, my husband used to rail about all this talk about rights and where were the responsibilities.
Yeah,
And that they really go together.
absolutely.
And that a lot of the things we might say are rights are responsibilities. I suppose it's the way the question you're asking or the issue you're dealing with as to whether it's a right or.
Yeah, well, absolutely. There's certainly, some wiggle room and stuff, but like they're so focused on this authoritarian aspect of controlling every aspect of their kids' lives that I think they wander astray from the things that are like really in a parent's wheelhouse. So like in short, as a parent, your responsibilities, keep them safe, instill a baseline of pro-social morals and ethics, and defend their own rights as a good in itself, not merely as extensions of yours. Now, this flies in the face of what these people believe. So, I'm not trying to convince them, of course, but I'm hoping this clarifies on our side what our principal stand is when we say, well, what you guys are talking about is bullshit. And just as a little soupçon of further discussion, like what do you think parental rights should and should not entail? Like I've mentioned, keeping kids safe, instilling some kind of a baseline morality, but not like, yes, Charlie.
Sorry, I'm like raising.
That's okay.
I think, without getting like too philosophical, I think the statement keeping kids safe is really vague because a parent can argue that it's not safe for my kid to be exposed to LGBT themes. And I think that part of the issue is it's really hard to get people to have universal agreement on what the responsibilities of a parent are, because even though some things may seem extremely obvious to us, there are people with different schools of thought that actually kind of fundamentally disagree with that. And so you're not going to be able to gain a consensus on what those responsibilities are. Because like we would think like doing the basic housing, food and clothing is like the bare minimum of like parental obligation, but some people don't agree that children are entitled to that
Wild.
as a basic. And so doing that is like above and beyond.
And so it really comes down, like, just like most of the things we can talk about in politics today, it's a difference of philosophy. And, you know, there might be some variations, within the wider framework of like what we all believe. But probably will mostly come down on the side of like, yeah, let's, you know, try to keep them safe. Whereas others, I guess I think the key difference is seeing them as human beings with value in and of themselves and seeing them as my little extension of myself that budded off of me like a strawberry bush. And that's not what children are, but that's a debate to have, you know, with them.
In the old book called Parent Effectiveness Training, the first 3 chapters talk about communicating with your kid. And I think they're very valuable. The last part of the book talks about values. And what it says is that values are different from wants and needs. It's what you believe. And the problem is that people can get into huge arguments if they want to fight about their values. So somebody says, I believe it's important to go to church every Sunday. Somebody else says, I don't think it's that important. Well, you should go, you know, and then it gets into an argument. And the whole idea at the end of the book is that you have to understand that it's the other person's value and be able to accept that they may think differently than you do about that. Now, in talking about raising kids, I always used to draw this graph that basically went from age 0 to 18. And when a kid is 0 years old or just born, a parent assumes 100% responsibility for them. When they hit 18, and that's arbitrary, you hope that the kid can be 100% responsible for themselves. And the difficult time is the crossover in the middle, because that's where a kid is starting to accept more responsibility for themselves than the parent. And some parents don't want to let go of that, and it creates difficulty. And so the kind of idea I put in is that as your kid is growing up, they're learning your values. And what you hope as they cross that midpoint and go on toward adulthood is they accept and adopt as many of your good values as possible. And you also hope that they do not adopt the ones that are bad, like smoking or drinking or stealing or doing other things like that, if the parent has done that and, you know, smoking and drinking are important to the parent. So we always hope that our kids adopt better values than we have been able to sometimes teach them.
We always hope that, but
Oh, I know.
other people want them to become carbon copies of
And
themselves.
how to get that across to somebody who's not gonna wanna listen to it is very difficult.
And then I think the only answer I see to that is society protecting those kids in the spaces that are societies to do that, like school and the library and certain churches like St. Mark's.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the things that, like, the right sees that weakness in their wall of ignorance and are seeking through these actions to prevent that.
Open it up, yeah.
So, very good points and difficult to negotiate, but I think that's the crux of it all for sure. Any other thoughts on what we think parents' rights can, should, shouldn't be?
I think, I mean, once you get into high school, you're experiencing everything. The world around you, you're getting your job, you're getting everything done. And when you have your parent just buckling down on you, saying, oh, you can't get a job, you can't go anywhere, you can't get your car, you can't do this, it's like, what the heck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you can't do that, you're gonna find ways to do it yourself. And the way that people do things and the way people find out the way to do things carves a path for them for the rest of their life. So if you start out doing bad stuff, you will end up doing bad stuff. Start doing good stuff, you'll continue to be good.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's very profound,
Yeah.
the way you said that. And I would maybe say one of the roles we hope for in parenting is to help find those good paths and not dictate them, but to set a child up to make good choices for themselves, and they don't always do that.
Yeah, and that's one problem is if a child is struggling because of over controlling parent, they really need to have someone to turn to talk and ask questions and get reasonable answers. And if they can't do that, they're gonna be in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this would prohibit that, I think, because they wouldn't be allowed to ask anybody outside of their parental scheme for any help.
Exactly, yeah.
There's people that don't move out of their house till they're like 25
Yep.
because of this.
Yep.
And it's only because something in their life happens to change that. And I think some of that in society today too affects how we are. We don't look behind the screen and be like, okay, there's Tommy over there. What's he doing at home?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Except in very, specific circumstances where, child protective services gets involved or whatever. But of course, if it's Tommy is 25 and still living at home, that no longer applies. So it's very tricky. Are you gonna say something, Columbo?
Yes, and Craig. Oh, this, cause something you said earlier sent me down the trail. There's the sort of pendulum swing of Munchausen syndrome and, Blanchard,
Gypsy Rose.
Gypsy Rose Blanchard, where to break the cycle, you then kill your parent.
Yeah, that's no good.
And so that dance of values is really precarious.
Does everybody know what Munchausen's is?
No, not really.
Munchausen's is where a parent does something to make their kid look sick so that they get attention in some way.
Yeah.
And the ones that I have seen was a baby that continued to have blood in its diaper. And somebody finally blood typed the blood and discovered it was not the baby's blood, it was mom's blood. So she was putting blood in the diaper so that the baby would get all of these tests and whatnot. And that's one I remember, but I remember some others too. And it's a form of abuse, and it's tricky because it's easy to miss.
Yeah.
That's what Munchausen's is.
That's a good segue into the next little section here, which is, and this is where that warning I gave at the top about, abusive situations really comes into play because we have, there are some legitimate concerns with unfettered parents' rights. Unfettered parental control of their kids is a recipe for abuse. Here's a quote that I found to consider. It is a myth that strangers most often abuse children. By far, the vast majority of maltreated children are victimized by those who are familiar to the child and who have ready access to the child. Relatives of the child are most often the perpetrators of child abuse. In particular, parents make up the majority of child abuse perpetrators, and that is from the Department of Health and Human Services, which I think is one of the departments that Republicans want to shut down. I can't imagine why. So it's very small, but you can see there's a pie chart, and it's got like one really big chunk and then like a bunch of teeny little mini chunks. And the big chunk is parents. It's not on there. I'm sorry, I'm just showing it to you.
I was gonna say, I can pull it up if you tell me how to find it.
But I mean, it's fine. It's parents are 81.2% of the pie, parents committing abuse towards their children. So I will also give the example of the state of Utah, very strong red Republican state. Utah has the strongest state level parents' rights laws. I don't know exactly what that all entails. But as a part of that, it's a hotbed of these fly-by-night wilderness survival disciplinary boot camps that parents from all over the country send their kids to when they're at their wits' end over such startling infractions as back talk and tried marijuana once. So of course, because of these things, the child must get sent away to this horrific scenario out in the wilds of Utah where teenaged counselors who have no requirement to have any training or certification whatsoever in survival, childcare, or whatever else are in charge of their kids and are like, hey, if you can't make fire, you go cold tonight. Hey, if you can't cook food, you don't eat tonight. Hey, if you can't carry the same thing of water on our forced march, you don't sleep tonight. And children get hurt this way and children die this way.
Can I interject a quick expertise
Yes.
blip? As a criminologist, boot camps are one of the methods of delinquency prevention that we all universally know it to be not effective.
Thank God. And yet people do it.
People still do it. Yes, if you were to ask any criminologist, definitely boot camps is like one of the top ones that we all universally agree through all the countless research, it does not work. It's
That's
not
good to
effective.
hear. Utah loves it. And if anyone has a deeper interest in hearing a really tragic case, I love true crime podcasts. Case File is an excellent true crime podcast. Look up case number 296. Aaron Bacon, that's Aaron, Aaron Bacon. It's really tragic and horrible. This kid was just like exploring his life and his parents thought that was not good and sent him away and he died. So that's data about it, the parents being the far and away the biggest abusers of children. Here's an anecdote. Here's a bit of testimony that I found. It's visceral, and so I will again reiterate my trigger warning for child sexual abuse and psychological torment. This person wrote, I was an abused child. I was mistreated, harmed, gaslit, and tormented. My father had to deal with CPS for a number of years after I called begging for help. The cop who initially arrived laughed in my face and told my father to beat me for having done so. My father would have psychotic fits of rage during which he would go on paranoid screeds about the government being evil for a variety of reasons. This on top of his rampant sexism. He once told me that men are the hunters and women are the gatherers, so men are superior, and covert racism. He had a severe persecution complex, and once his divorce with his second wife happened, I was 10, he really began to brainwash me. I spent a great deal of my life believing things that were completely insane. I've caused a lot of harm in my life and gone through a ton of suffering because he was a total lunatic with unrestricted access to me at all times. Parents can and routinely do hurt children. However, the most vocal parents' rights advocates are typically the ones doing shit like what I've suffered through. I don't care what they say. I don't give a shit about their personal freedoms. Parents absolutely should not be allowed to do the insane things my father did to me. I have always been and will always be broken. I had a chance and he fucked that chance out of me. Parental rights are nothing in the face of child safety. End of story. And that gives me, like, every time I read that, it's devastating. And there's a sense on the right among these people who are very vocal about this, that every family is like their family. And of course, their family is perfect. I don't mistreat my children, so no one else will mistreat their children. Never mind that their value of mistreating my children may vary from their children's idea of that, for example. But that's the sense we get. We get pushback on social media when we stand up against this kind of thing, and we get people saying, you're just trying to sow discord and happy families.
There was a program in our area until a few years
Oh, I know,
ago, and
yeah.
I think it's closed now.
Yes.
But it was very similar because parents would take their kids there, even though they were in treatment.
Yeah.
And the organization would say, we want you to stop this medicine that this kid has been getting, and we're gonna fix them without that. The other one that I'm reminded of is the Catholic girls' homes in England that closed in the mid 1990s. So that went on for years and years and years.
Yeah, the institutionalized version of individual parental abuse is also deeply horrific. So they think everything's hunky-dory. How dare you sow this discord when there are like kids being treated like this person? And I get that, like, there is some good intent behind some of the parents' rights movement. I don't agree with it, but I get that there is some good intent behind it. I get that there is a desire to know what's going on in your kid's life. To my mind, if you're concerned about being in the know about what's going on in your kids' lives, the wrong solution to that is requiring school officials to surveil and report on them, because that's what the laws that they try to pass would do, or the policies they want to enforce would do. They would say if your child is going by different pronouns at school and they do at home, the school would have to report that. I can't imagine any problems that might bring up. So rather than wanting the school to surveil and report, I think the much more logical solution to a desire to know what's going on with your kids is to be the kind of parent your kids want to confide in, which means you exude trust and confidence and the capacity to accept your children for who they are, no matter what. And to get okay with the reality that you won't always know everything going on in your child's lives, because that's the nature of the relationship. They are their own people. You will not always know everything about them. But if you want to know as much as you can to do what, if you think you have the ability to keep them safe and keep them secure, be the parent they can talk to, not the parent they're hiding things from. And another thing these parents' rights people talk about is like, I want to know what's being taught to my kids. I want to know what they're learning. I want to know what books they're reading. I've got a solution for that too. Yeah, read the damn syllabus. It comes home for every class. Go to parent-teacher meetings. Call or email the teacher. Go to PTA meeting. Like, there are ways to do this that don't involve bringing the massive force of the state down upon every child. So what is the GOP strategy and where is all this coming from? And here's where I get into a lot of stuff that ain't. So from the New York State website, talking back about Prop 1, because Prop 1 is our attempt to build guardrails around our children's rights and a bunch of other people's rights as well, but in particular for this conversation, our children's rights. That's a big threat, as I intimated before, to Republicans everywhere and to New York State Republicans. From their website, they claim Prop 1 adds gender identity and gender expression and covers all persons, including minors. These new constitutional rights will grant minor children the right to transgender and other types of medical interventions, all without parental notification or consent. Parents will remain financially and legally responsible for managing emotional and physical results impacting their minor children. And I want to pause there to point out the seeming resentment with which Republican policymakers express having to still be responsible for their children's well-being, even if they let them down by turning out to be trans or gay, as if they're only deserving of care if they stay perfectly straight and cis. Oh, it's making me angry. Some other headlines, so Republicans build momentum as they drive anti-LGBTQ legislation nationwide. So going wider scope from Prop 1, driving this legislation nationwide. Oakley of the Human Rights Campaign, so someone who's fighting back against these kinds of campaigns, said the activism from right-wing groups cast as support for women and parents has little to do with either. These are not people who care about women's sports, which is another area of this we haven't talked a lot about, but that's a talking point you get. They are not people who care about women's sports. They are 100% people who are trying to turn back the clock on LGBTQ equality, whether that's legal equality or acceptance. They don't care how, they just care that it happens. And it makes the point that the reason for this in this moment is it's because of marriage equality. When the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage under the Obergefell versus Hodges decision in 2015, it was a stinging defeat for many Republicans. And oh my Lord, they can't stand being stung. Jesus, how dare you sting us? I got stung. I was in the emergency room for 8 hours. See if I'm complaining about it. I still am. They were stunned at how quickly the culture has shifted in support of gay marriage and were left to regroup. Now they see an opportunity to build momentum for broader restrictions on LGBTQ Americans. Republicans lied and they misrepresented and they made people afraid and they got traction for that reason, Oakley from the Human Rights Campaign said. So they suffered this big defeat, this big culture shifting defeat, and not having anything they could do about that in the moment, they went after LGBTQ kids. And they cast it as being parents' rights and for the good of the children. At this point, I would like to watch the first video. What time do we have?
1:45.
Okay, everybody still good?
Oh, yeah,
Mhm.
definitely.
Okay, good.
Do we
Yes.
do we have
Yeah.
an idea of the polling of how this vote's gonna go?
I have no idea. I don't think anybody's doing any like state polling on this kind of a thing. Maybe it's out there somewhere. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's
Unfortunately, the publicity is really one-sided.
We've got signs at the Democratic headquarters for a vote yes finally. We could only get 50 of them. So if you're interested in grabbing one, they're at the headquarters.
Yeah, can I have one? A Harris sign or?
Those are all gone. These are the vote yes on Prop 1 signs, because there's so many vote no signs.
So
We
I
have-
can just stop in, or how do I
You
get?
just stop in.
The Democratic Building?
Yep.
And can you see the video? Thumbs up? Okay.
Great.
Every single person has a different opinion on how education should work, and it is my job as YouTube's resident teacher-turned-video essayist to share my insights into these opinions, and that is exactly what I have in store today. Because I have been working on a big video about the war on public education, and as part of the research for that video, I've been immersing myself in the right-wing perspective on schools. Part of the conservative pushback against public schools, especially against the current boogeymen of critical race theory and LGBTQ representation, comes from self-described parents' rights advocates, a group that includes parents of school kids who believe that their voices aren't being heard or respected by schools, as well as politicians who are passing laws to help cement a parents' bill of rights in various states. But as I was looking into the parents' rights movement, I started noticing some trends in the way that their arguments are framed that I felt deserved a video on its own. Specifically, I noticed that the way that these parents' rights people talk about kids is both very weird and actually kind of concerning. Now, I'm not going to get into the actual legal element of parents' rights stuff because I'm not a lawyer, but I am a former teacher with a degree in rhetoric, so I want to look at the language that politicians and parents use to talk about parents and their children. Because when you look under the surface, there is some wild stuff here. Before we get into things, I want to give a little content warning for some brief discussions of child abuse, because of course that is where this video is going. But anyway, if we are going to talk about parents' rights stuff, we first need to figure out who parents' rights advocates are and what they want. The parents' rights label is vague enough that it's used by lots of different people who don't all necessarily agree on what it means. On one end, it is used by groups like Moms for Liberty and PragerU, who want to gut the entire education system, starting with CRT, SEL, DEI, LGBT, and all of the other acronyms that teachers' unions are apparently using to brainwash children. And on the other end, it's used by groups like Red, Wine, and Blue, who support public schools and LGBTQ rights, and want to take back the parents' rights label from those more extreme voices. In this video, I am talking specifically about that first group. The term parents' rights isn't inherently harmful or anything, so as I examine it throughout this video, remember that I am just looking at how specific people use that term to frame their goals. And their goals are certainly something. When a movement is focused on restoring parents' rights, you have to ask, parents' rights to what? When groups like Moms for Liberty or PragerU use the term, it is usually associated with transparency in schools. Parents, they argue, just want to know what their kids are being taught. And in theory, this isn't a bad thing. I think transparency is good. I think parents getting engaged in their kids' learning is a good thing. But parents' rights doesn't just stop there, because they don't just want transparency for transparency's sake. They don't want to know what's being taught so they can have a fuller understanding of what their kids are learning. They want transparency because they want control. They want to know what books are in the school's library so that they can make the library remove the books that have LGBTQ characters. They want to know what the history curriculum looks like so that they can refuse to let their child be taught about the US's history of racism. And this is why they care so much about school board meetings. One of the best ways to have a hand in what happens at your kid's school is by making your voice heard by the people in charge. But this is old news, right? We all know about the calls for book banning and the limits on how history, sex ed, and other subjects are taught. That isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is how parents' rights advocates talk about kids. To show you what I'm talking about, look at the language that Moms for Liberty members use around mask mandates. As the Washington Post reported, when a Florida school board voted to keep a mask mandate in place in 2021, Jody Hand, a 52-year-old mother of 3, jumped to her feet. "I am going to be spending every minute making sure parents know they don't have control over their children anymore," she shouted. Jody, who the article said was wearing Moms for Liberty merch during the meeting, just stated the thesis of the movement out loud. Parents' rights, according to Moms for Liberty, isn't about transparency or wanting to be heard. It's about control. Parents' rights means the right to have full, uninhibited control over children. Not every parents' rights advocate is as transparent about this goal, but the language that they use certainly points in that direction. In his recent book, Keeping the Kids All Right: How to Empower Your Children Against the Leftist Agenda Without Homeschooling, popular conservative radio personality Barack Lurie gives advice for how parents can successfully indoctrinate their children. And I'm not editorializing here either. He literally says the goal of parenting is to indoctrinate your child. This is indoctrination, but it's also the right thing to do. You're the parent, it's your job. Everything you do is indoctrination one way or the other. So how do we successfully indoctrinate our kids? We drip feed them a steady diet of straw man arguments and actively make fun of people who disagree with us. He provides sample dialogues between himself and his children where he shows off these techniques for indoctrination, but in all of the examples, the child always agrees with him. First of all, it is really easy to make up a conversation that makes you look good, especially when it's a fictional conversation between a middle-aged man and a 10-year-old. And second of all, he states that he begins each conversation by asking the child for their opinion on whatever topic they're discussing, because it shows them you have respect for their input and thought process. It engages them while giving them an opportunity to obtain your approval. But there's a difference between acting like you care about someone's opinion and actually caring about it. Clearly, he doesn't actually care about their opinion, because if he did, he'd be open to hearing an opinion that isn't exactly the same as his own. And to make things worse, there's also an implication that his approval is contingent on the child agreeing with him. Lurie cannot imagine a world where his child holds a different opinion, and he only respects and approves of his kids because they agree with him. Contrary to what the book's title suggests, Barack Lurie doesn't want to empower his kids. He wants to control them until they can flawlessly parrot all of his opinions back to him. But maybe this is just one very silly Bond villain of a man who should not be taken seriously by anyone for any reason, right? Unfortunately, things get worse. Things get a lot worse. But before we get into the really heavy stuff, let's take a little break and watch a watercolor time-lapse while I tell you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes on a huge array of topics.
If you, it should be pretty clear when it ends. They've all got to pay the bills somehow. Dollar ideas for Skillshare.
All right, let's get back into things. It might be easy to dismiss one awful guy writing about indoctrinating kids, but the rhetoric of control is all over the place. Consider how parents' rights advocates talk about LGBTQ issues. Many school districts are passing rules requiring teachers and counselors to tell parents anytime a student changes their gender identity or starts using different pronouns. Because, parents' rights folks argue, parents have a right to know the decisions that their children are making at school. But when parents are so worried about what the school does or does not want to tell them, there's no consideration of what their child wants. What if your child simply wants to experiment with different pronouns to see what fits? What if your child is just waiting for the right time to talk to you about it? What if your child doesn't want you to know because they're worried you won't support them? Because the truth is, they don't care what their child wants. They would argue that their child is too young to make any decision about their gender or sexuality, or that their child is being unduly influenced by teachers trying to turn them gay, so the child's opinion can just be totally disregarded. What the child wants doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what the parents want. Just like they only want to know what books are in the library so they can tell the school which books to get rid of, they only want to know if their child is questioning their gender identity so they can stop them from doing so. And what makes it even worse is that this doesn't even just end at their own children. They want these rules in place for everyone. And when taken to its extreme, this rhetoric of parental control can lead to devastating consequences. I won't get into too much of it here, but the book To Train Up a Child by Michael and Debbie Pearl uses the Bible to justify parents hitting their children and depriving them of food to break their will and train them to be obedient. And let's not forget my video on PragerU's so-called parenting expert, who used the same language of obedience to justify locking kids in their rooms for hours at a time. Everywhere you look, it is about control. But when you have full control over something else, not just a responsibility to keep it safe, but a right to use it however you want, shy of actively harming it, that's not how you treat human beings. It's how you treat property. They see children as property. And I'm not reading between the lines or putting words into people's mouths. A few years ago, Senator Rand Paul literally just said parents own their children. And just a few weeks ago, PragerU's Jill Simonian said parents should act accordingly when school board members say that parents don't own their children. Which they don't. Parents do not own their children. That is just a factual statement. And again, I don't want to get into the minutiae around the legal relationships between children and their parents. I just want to focus on the language of ownership that Rand Paul and Jill Simonian are using, the language of indoctrination that Barack Lurie uses, the language of training and obedience that Michael and Debbie Pearl use, and the language of control that Moms for Liberty uses. None of this is language you use to describe a good relationship between human beings who respect each other. It's language you use to describe monetary transactions and animals. Consider the case of Annabella Rockwell, who started college a happy-go-lucky young woman and then left an angry feminist who blamed the patriarchy for all her problems. But don't worry, because her mom paid a deprogrammer $300 a day to fix her. $300 a day! Oh yeah, did I mention that she's an heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune? Anyway, Annabella's parents were so distraught that their daughter was different after having grown up and left the nest that they dropped thousands of dollars to get their little girl back. They couldn't accept that she had changed, so they treated her like a computer that started malfunctioning after an update and paid someone to do a factory reset. And now she works as a fundraiser for PragerU. Similarly, throughout Keeping the Kids All Right, Barack Lurie defends his position on indoctrination by saying, indoctrination is what parents do. In fact, indoctrination is your #1 job. Others can demand that right to indoctrinate your children when they do all the baby carrying, feeding, diaper changing, doctor visits, driving to school and after-school activities and sports, and pay for them all. Until then, they can shut up. In other words, you are entitled to indoctrinate your kids because you paid for them. He also constantly refers to teachers as thieves, who you're essentially just handing your valuables to when you send your kids to school. Children aren't people. They are objects that can be stolen. Once you see how the parents' rights language of control objectifies kids, you start seeing it everywhere in every right-wing policy position that affects children. It's why they don't fight for free school lunch. As North Dakota Senator Mike Wabima said, I can understand children going hungry, but is that really the problem of the school district? It's really a problem of parents being negligent with their kids. If children are the property of their parents, it's the parents' responsibility to take care of their property. It's why they want to implement physical examinations of child athletes to verify their biological sex. Because they don't care about the privacy of the children whose bodies they're inspecting. They don't care how invasive and traumatic it is to have your body treated like crime scene evidence. They only care about using those bodies as pawns in their culture war. It's why so many parents and politicians fight for the right to use corporal punishment at home and in schools. Because even though hitting another adult counts as assault, battery, or domestic violence, as long as you are hitting a child the right way, it's okay. Adults' rights to discipline children however they see fit matters more than children's right to safety, to say nothing of the slew of other issues that are linked with corporal punishment. And it's why they don't fight for gun control to address the rise in school shootings. Because adults' Second Amendment rights matter more than children's right to safety. We shouldn't limit the freedoms of real people just to protect kids, right? All of this is to say that when we prioritize the power of parents to control their children, we actively dehumanize the very people we are allegedly trying to protect. As of 2023, I am not a parent, but I also don't think that you should have to be a parent to care about how kids are treated. And right now, there is a growing movement that actively frames children as the property of their parents. And I think that's a bad thing. A lot of these arguments come down to, well, parents own their kids, and if the parents don't own the kids, then the state must own the kids. But I don't think anyone owns kids, because kids aren't property. They're people. Now, it's a surprisingly controversial position to see children as full human beings who deserve agency over their own lives, so if you are interested in learning more about it, check out this video by Andrewism and the book Trust Kids, an anthology of essays and poems.
And I was gonna have a whole section on rights kids do have, but that's more than we can get into right now. Suffice it to say that kids do have rights, human beings have rights. They're no less so for being children than adults, so like that doesn't affect the rights that they have. There's some reasonable limits placed on them, which the next video actually will detail. But it's wrong to think of kids as extensions of ourselves, bereft of rights and dignity and agency. And I will point out that the US is one of the few countries that has not adopted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is pretty chilling when you consider everything that the right is kind of looming over children to just, you know, try and. Yes, I have. And so that UN convention would include the right to choose for children to choose their own religion, access education, and form their own opinions, among others, basically safeguarding kids' individual consciences and autonomy. So the United States hasn't signed on to that, so it does not recognize those rights. It would not be legally binding anyway, that's not how the UN works, but it would at least be a framework that we could build from, and we currently do not. So that being said, there are some legitimate parents' rights, parental rights, legal parental rights. And this next video is going to get into that. A lawyer who's going to be talking about what legitimate rights.
So when you procreate, that new little human being that you brought into the world comes with a lot of legal strings attached. Those strings include responsibilities you are legally obligated to take on, and liabilities you are legally obligated to take on if your semen demon breaks the laws, as well as some constitutional rights that have been established over years of Supreme Court precedent. First, let's talk your responsibilities. If you have a kid, you're responsible for that little crumb cruncher's well-being, including providing a safe living environment, protecting the child from abuse and other dangers, paying child support as ordered, fulfilling the child's basic needs like food, shelter, and water, disciplining the child, investing in the child's education, knowing the child's interests, and spending quality time with the child. If you don't live up to these requirements, then a court could order that you don't deserve to have any rights over that little rugrat, and they'll take them from you. Of course, many parents get away with not knowing the kid's interests or spending quality time with them and not disciplining them in any constructive way, all without any court intervention. So as with many things, the law can only go so far, and what happens behind closed doors is often outside the purview of the law unless someone intervenes and calls Child Protective Services. Alright, but then if that crib lizard becomes a tween who likes to break laws, well then you've got some liabilities on your hands. In most states, if your kiddo injures another person or damages property and they're under 18, you as the parent could face civil or even criminal penalties for their actions. You could be held liable for compensating the harmed party, though different states do impose different limits on age and limits on the total amount of damages you'd have to pay. Also, most states have laws against contributing to the delinquency of a minor. I'm in Minnesota, so I looked up the Minnesota statute. It says any person who by act, word, or omission encourages, causes, or contributes to delinquency of a child or to the child's status as a juvenile petty offender is guilty of a gross misdemeanor, unless the parent took reasonable steps to control the child's conduct. Then that could be a valid defense to any claim of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Notice that it's a person who by act or omission contributes to the delinquency. So that's pretty broad, and it means it's as much about what you didn't do or failed to do as it is about any affirmative act you took with regards to your child. Many states also have firearm access prevention laws that make it illegal for a parent to leave a firearm within reach of a child, as well as internet access and computer hacking laws that hold a parent responsible for their child's online crimes. So if you got a little crotch critter running around, you'd do best to keep one eye on them and their activities, lest ye be held responsible for further crimes. Okay, so those are your responsibilities and liabilities, but what most people, especially conservatives, are screaming about when it comes to parents' rights are the rights that they perceive to be their constitutional rights, rights protected by the US Constitution. And I say perceive because I would bet a lot of money that most parents screaming parents' rights while being bigoted and actively harming children probably have no idea what the Constitution actually protects. So let's go over it. First, let me say this. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about the rights that parents have over their children. Any constitutional rights that parents have gained have been based on interpretation of the Constitution through Supreme Court precedent. And the way the Supreme Court has found that parents do have rights that aren't explicitly written in the Constitution is through the unenumerated rights in the 14th Amendment. If that sounds familiar, that's because the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause also contains the unenumerated rights to same-sex marriage, contraception, and until recently, abortion. The source of the so-called parental rights in the Constitution that conservatives are so certain that they have is the same source that they are constantly screaming against when it comes to abortion, contraception, and same-sex marriage. None of these rights are written down. They've been found to exist by the Supreme Court as part of the idea of liberty protected by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's right, fuckwads. You want to start breaking down long-held Supreme Court precedent about fundamental freedoms? That shit can go both ways. Let's fucking tango, baby. But listen, it is true that for the past century, the Supreme Court has read into the 14th Amendment of the Constitution certain fundamental rights held by parents. There are a handful of important cases in the parental rights jurisprudence. Let's dive into them, shall we? In Mayer v. Nebraska in 1923, the court held that a statute forbidding the teaching of any foreign language, specifically German in this case, in public, private, and parochial schools to kids under 12, impermissibly encroached on the liberty parents possess. The court explained that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment protects this liberty, incorporating the right to marry, establish a home, and bring up children. Basically, the law was trying to say that children should be indoctrinated with the American way of life with English, and they shouldn't learn any other language until 8th grade, so that when they're their youngest, most impressionable, they're properly taught what it means to be an American. Which sounds like a conservative wet dream, frankly, but the Supreme Court found that that law infringed on the liberty of the parent to avail themselves of whatever schooling and whatever language they wanted for their kid as long as it didn't harm them. And just as a side note, if you're like, wow, that's wild, in 1923, who's teaching their kids German? For context, my grandfather, so my mom's dad, was born in central Minnesota in the 1930s, the child of like second or third generation German immigrants, and his first language was German. He didn't learn English until he started school at 6. I like thinking about history and Supreme Court precedent in that type of context because it brings it home a little more. This is not ancient history. You have known people in your lifetime who are affected by the laws the Supreme Court put in place a century ago. Hell, you are still affected by many of them today. Anyway, I digress. So, Mayer v. Nebraska held that the 14th Amendment protects the liberty to bring up children in your home without overbroad governmental interference. Then, 2 years later, in 1925, the Supreme Court made a ruling in Pierce v. Society of Sisters. Relying on Mayer v. Nebraska, the case we just talked about, the court struck down an Oregon statute requiring children to attend public schools. They said that this statute interfered with the right of parents to select private or parochial schools for their children, and they said that it lacked a reasonable relation to any purpose within the competency of the state. They also, however, acknowledged that the state should concern itself with the well-being of children and with the public welfare, but in this specific case, the requirement to attend public schools goes too far. In 1944, in Prince v. Massachusetts, the court held that states may prosecute parents when they expose their children to serious hazards to their well-being. The facts of the case are interesting, though. Specifically here, the guardian of a 9-year-old girl gave her religious magazines to go sell in the streets. And it was against the law in Massachusetts at the time for someone that young to be selling things and working in that capacity. The guardian said it was within her religious freedom to have the kid sell these religious texts on the street. And the court was like, nah, okay? The power of the state to control the conduct of children is broader than its power over adults. And there is no denial of any equal protection or religious freedom because this is a law applied to all children. You don't get special treatment because you belong to a certain religion and you want to break a child labor law in furtherance of that religion. So this was a limit of parental freedoms. Your religion does not give you free rein to submit your child to hazards to their well-being. All right? Moving on, we have Wisconsin v. Yoder, decided in 1972. The court held that Wisconsin's compulsory education law that required all students to attend school violated an Amish father's rights to take his 15-year-old children out of school to complete their education in Amish ways at home. The court said the state's interest in universal education is not totally free from a balancing process when it impinges on other fundamental rights, such as those specifically protected by the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment and the traditional interest of parents with respect to the religious upbringing of their children. Okay, so you can't submit your child to hazards to their well-being in furtherance of your religion, but your religion does matter when it comes to state laws on how to educate your children. But the court also said there is no doubt as to the power of a state having a high responsibility for education of its citizens to impose reasonable regulations for the control and duration of basic education. Because of this, the Amish parents had to demonstrate the adequacy of their alternative mode of continuing informal vocational education in terms of the overall interest that the state relies on in support of its program of compulsory high school education. Meaning, they had to show that what they were teaching at home after pulling the kid from school still was adequate under the state's criteria. So yes, religion, but also, the state has an interest in the education of its citizens. That's why it also has a say in what you teach your kid when you homeschool them, for example. Then in 2000, we have Troxel v. Granville. In this case, the court declared a Washington state law unconstitutional because it was very broad and gave the state way too much power to grant visitation rights to non-parents, even when the parent objected. In this case, the court ruled that the grandparents had to have a certain amount of visitation days, even though the mom didn't want it. And so the Supreme Court was like, nah, that's way too broad, and it infringes on parental rights over who gets to see their kids. In this case, the court again asserted that the 14th Amendment protects parental rights, saying the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause has a substantive component that provides heightened protection against government interference with certain fundamental rights and liberty interests, including parents' fundamental right to make decisions concerning the care, custody, and control of their children. However, in a dissent in that case, the conservatives' own special boy, Scalia, said that parents' right to control their children's upbringing was an unenumerated right, and that the judiciary actually should not be the ones who are enforcing this right at all. It should be up to the legislature, according to Scalia. Later, in 2015, before a law school audience, Scalia reiterated this point, saying that parental rights just simply are not in the Constitution. Just like abortion isn't explicitly in the Constitution, nor is the right to contraception, nor is the right to same-sex marriage. It's all made up by the Supreme Court. And even with the protections that currently exist for parents based on Supreme Court precedent, that precedent still does not give parents the right to do things like go into a public school and dictate what is or is not taught in the school's curriculum. That is not protected by the Constitution or any Supreme Court precedent. And in fact, according to a Washington Post article, common law and case law have long supported the idea that education should prepare young people to think for themselves, even if that runs counter to the wishes of the parents. That article goes on to say, Republicans gain an electoral advantage by convincing their base that white children are being taught to hate themselves, their families, and their country. Whether this supposed attack on the American way of life is being coordinated by Black Lives Matter activists, Marxist educators, or Antifa operatives, the point is to generate an enemy thought of as being totally evil and totally unappeasable. And boy, is it working. However, conservatives also know that parental rights appear nowhere in the Constitution. And what happens when something that you want is on legally shaky grounds and found nowhere written in the Constitution? You make an amendment to the Constitution. Conservative lawmakers have proposed parents' rights amendments to the US Constitution, so far with little success, for years. One of the most recent ones was introduced by Republican Representative Debbie Lesko of Arizona, and it would establish that the liberty of parents to direct the upbringing, education, and care of their children is a fundamental right. The amendment further says that the parental right to direct a child's education includes the right to choose public, private, religious, or home schools, and the right to make reasonable choices choices within public schools for one's child. And with the passage of laws like the recent law in Utah that restricts usage of social media by minors and requires age verification and parental monitoring for social media, plus laws aimed at protecting trans children from the professional medical care that they are seeking, and laws restricting the teaching of critical race theory in schools, laws all of which involve the state stepping in and controlling children and their parents, it's clear that all of this parental rights bullshit is just conservatives talking out their asses. Because if they really cared about a parent's unalienable right to have control over their child, how the child is raised, and what the child is taught, they would leave all of this, social media usage, medical treatments, and more, in the hands of parents. Instead, it's clear by their actions that they are concerned about controlling parents and children so that they can be indoctrinated with the right ideas. Ideas often based in a white supremacist Christian ideology that runs counter to the ethos of the US Constitution. But ideas that have been allowed to proliferate because of ignorance of what the Constitution actually says, combined with the fear-mongering of conservatives at the highest level. And with the way culture wars are currently playing out in America, it's survival of the fittest when it comes to which ideology our children will be indoctrinated with, at the expense of their well-being, their ability to think freely and critically for themselves, and sometimes at the expense of their very lives. Thanks once again to my partner on today's video, Warby Parker. Go to warbyparker.com/Legia to
Parker.
Got great glasses.
Yeah. Yeah.
I bet you.
So, that really, I'm sure we're all experts on constitutional law now, right? But it gives you a sense of what is and is not a right that parents have, and this whole thing about they're all unenumerated rights, which usually Republicans are like, hey, that's not real. You don't get to be married to the person you love. So I just want to leave you with a couple other little things. I found this meme because we all get the best information from memes, but it's a Catholic nun explaining pro-life in a way that will stun many, especially Republican lawmakers. And this gets at like the deeper issue that all of this is encapsulated by. She says, I do not believe that just because you're opposed to abortion that makes you pro-life. In fact, I think in many cases, your morality is deeply lacking if all you want is a child born, but not a child fed, not a child educated, not a child housed. And why would I think that you don't? Because you don't want any tax money to go there. That's not pro-life, that's pro-birth. We need a much broader conversation on what the morality of pro-life is. Put another way, I found a comment on YouTube that says, conservatives say, fetuses are humans from conception. Conservatives also say, parents should have absolute power over every facet of a child's life with no limitations for 18 years after birth. So which is it? And a very final thought that I will leave you with, which is a page taken from a book that some of us know very well. It is the most recent book club offering from the LGBTQ book club, Someone to Build a Nest In, which I have still not finished reading, but I read this page.
What you're gonna read?
I read this page last night. It's a book about parenting in interesting ways. We should have a whole nother meeting once I finish it, and maybe have you gotten the audiobook yet? So there are these monsters, and sometimes the monsters procreate by laying eggs, and sometimes they procreate by like shedding parts of their body that then become other monsters. And this one monster is trying to find its shed procreation monster and like help it because there are other people after it that want to kill it. So they finally met and they're confronting each other, and this is what happens. The procreated monster. It nestled into her, legs against the touch of her hands and against the width of her legs. Several tendrils opened orifices to suck at her riding trousers like it wanted to dissolve the human custom of clothing and bond with her. Its flank squeezed narrower until it had a shape like one of her bent legs, like her offspring was trying to fit in with the rest of her body, like it wanted to come home to her. It would have been easy to subdue and ingest this thing, so fragile and so submissive. It was more of a meal than a child. In no time, it would be part of her again, restored to the will that it missed. But it wasn't a part of her anymore. It didn't belong to her. The monster in this book is a better parent than any parents' rights activist, right-wing asshole blowhard you will meet from here to Alaska. vote yes on Prop 1, vote Harris Walls. Let's get this done.
I don't know. I think you've covered everything tonight. We've discovered that this whole campaign that they use fear and tug at emotional heartstrings and emotionally exploit parents is just a smokescreen for control, and it's just a smokescreen for getting their way, because they know that the anti-abortion stance that they're occupying is so unpopular. It's the only way they can get for people to vote no. And I think when you talk about parents' rights, and when they talk about it too, they often talk about how including trans girls on an athletic team is a matter of safety. They do all these things. They like cover every base here. We have to, you're making your kids safe if you vote no on Prop 1. It's really insidious. I will share today that I had told Alex that I ran into the deacon of my church. I go to St. Mike's a couple weeks ago after he preached against Prop 1 from the pulpit, and he used the language of Protect Kids New York, the coalition that's working against Proposition 1 and that has aligned itself with the New York State Catholic Conference of Bishops. And I'm trying to write a letter and just to my deacon. I said, I'd like to really tell you what I think about it. And he was very welcoming of kind of a dialogue via email. So I'm getting all my thoughts together and my links and reading all the legal stuff. And I thought, he just gets his marching orders from the bishop. So why don't I call the New York State Catholic Conference and see, what do they know about this? Where did the position come from? So I called today and I spoke to Kristen, who was their spokesperson for Prop 1. And by the end of the conversation, she hung up on me. And I really think that was a good thing. I really think she was flustered from the start of the conversation. I think she relied on a lot of the this is Catholic teaching, this is why we oppose it. And I said, but these laws are already in place. We have gender, there's already trans girls competing on teams, because we took care of that in 2019. Minors already have consent for certain things. They will not get consent for gender affirming care. And when they say, well, this was her answer, so be prepared for this answer. She said, because Proposition 1 is written vaguely, the courts could at some point look at the fact that they've included age in there and say that transgender minors could access gender affirming hormone treatments and surgeries. But the reason the way you push back on that is that's not the standard of care in the United States. It's not going to happen. Why would New York State grant that when all of the medical organizations say it's too important? We need to have a parent or someone in a parental role supporting this person during transition. So I could rebut everything she said. So she finally said, I work for the bishop. You need to just call your bishop and tell your bishop this. So I said, okay, I'll tell my bishop. And so she said, fine. And she hung up the phone. And I thought, okay, I guess that's a good thing. I guess I needed to know that. It's interesting, really is. So they say their research says that these are all things that parents have to be scared about, that it will eventually come. And I don't think that's true. I think that there's an alignment way back somewhere deep between partisan operatives and the Catholic Church that just keeps this going. So
For sure.
So
well, thank you.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that was my day.
Yeah, sounds like an exciting day. And thank you for that you know, the parry, counter parry that we can engage in there, because that's really helpful to have those things at our fingertips. Any other thoughts or feelings before we disembark into the night?
Just on the issue of abortion, having been a neonatologist and working with preemies, the youngest that we could potentially save, I think, was 26 weeks. If they were born before then, there was no way that we could preserve them. And a lot of times it's not, you know, it's a miscarriage or something like that. It's not because they're being taken to a delivery room and on purpose being delivered. It just doesn't work. And they are awfully tiny. I know there's technologies now that help younger ones than we were able to, but it's a real dilemma.
Yeah.
I think on the issue of having a proposition passed that sort of gives permission one way or another. If it's done that way, then the possibility is that a few years down the road, a court or government will say, oh, well, we did it wrong, let's just change it again. Until it's codified into an amendment or something like that, where they should have a much harder time doing it.
Well, so this would change the Constitution, so I think this would accomplish that, I believe.
Is it an amendment?
It would amend.
It would amend
the state.
The state.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so I mean, for what that's worth, you know, but
In the Chronicle Express, they printed the old language, and in bold is the new language. It's the amendments that it would make. So if you get a chance, that one.
I know something you've been looking into is the difference between this idea that, oh, it grants all these new rights versus the idea that it prevents discrimination, and like preventing discrimination is very
Well,
different
and
from
one thing is
permitting a lot of other
preventing
things.
discrimination based on ethnicity,
Right.
as opposed to race.
In addition to race,
In
yeah.
addition to race, you know, ethnicity is a little bit different.
Yeah, so it's covering that base, yeah. Marcia was really mad that John printed the text of the proposition.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah,
That's
like,
what newspapers do.
yeah, it's the text of the proposition. What's your problem, lady?
Did you send out the links to these two videos?
Sure, I can do that. Well, thank you, everyone. I got real hot and bothered over this one, as you could probably tell. But I hope you all know more about it in general. I hope you're all feeling confident about voting yes on Proposition 1. Tell people in your lives about it, because like people who weren't here today, and you know, they are coming at it with the same lack of information that we started with. So we need to be, we need to be informed in order to make informed decisions. So you all are now armed with knowledge, so go out and let people know. Maybe particularly the people you think will be, you know, friendly towards the idea, and you can let other people by the wayside. Run up those numbers.
And if you can't find a Harris Waltz sign and you have an old Harris Biden one, cut off the Biden and just have it say.
There you go.
Rich Stewart probably has 100 of those in his garage.
He probably does. If they didn't
I've seen every time I've finally taken old signs back, they're all there.
Yeah.
They're
He's funny.
all there.
Yeah. Well, that about does it. We only went a half hour over time, so that's not too bad. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you. One other thing that might be interesting this week, Friday evening.
Oh, yeah.
At the Art Center.
Oh.
There's a presentation by a fellow who's an artist on Day of the Dead.
Oh, yes.
From, I think, Oaxaca, Mexico. I don't know if he's from there, but he's gonna do a presentation about it.
What time is that?
I'd have to look.
Okay, because, and that reminded me, thank you for telling me so I can give you a alternate thing to do. Or maybe they will both fit together if it's a little bit earlier or whatever. It's movie night again this week, on Friday at 6.
That is at 4.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
No conflict. Excellent. Movie night here. We're watching Gods and Monsters, the brilliant Brendan Fraser, Ian McKellen movie about the director James Whale. who was a gay man, and he directed Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, and is one of my favorites. So for Halloween. Yeah. Even though I think it mostly takes place like on a bright summer afternoon in Southern California, but still.
That's still scary.
Yes. Hope to see you again. Thank you all very much.